Welcome, welcome. This video is about natural disasters. In this video, I'm exploring the human elements, the man-made elements of a natural disaster. Is a natural disaster only due to natural causes, or is it also due to human causes? Also, I'm investigating how can the number of casualties be reduced. Um, and I'm discussing what mistakes have been made dealing with natural disasters. Okay, let's begin. I'm asking you, what comes to mind when you think about a natural disaster? What's the first thing you think of? Well, maybe it's the tsunami of 2004, or maybe the hurricane of 2010 in Haiti. These were all examples of huge natural disasters with a lot of casualties, a lot of property damage, and a lot of media attention. Most natural disasters, however, are smaller than that. A lot of them have only a small amount of casualties. For instance, a landslide in a rural area with only 30 casualties. It won't be in the news so much, but for the families it's just as tragic. Now, what kind of disasters are there? Natural disasters. Well, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, landslides, tsunamis, droughts, and probably you can name some more. These can be categorized by in the following adjectives: mild or severe, deadly, when there's a fair amount of casualties, and catastrophic, when there are really hundreds and hundreds of casualties. Um, the impact of a natural disaster. Well, natural disasters can lead to casualties, injured people, damage to houses, to infrastructure. But and also afterwards, there might not be electricity, there might not be food or water. It will be difficult for people to get through the days afterwards without help. What people tend to forget about the impact of a natural disaster is that it also affects the ways of people to make a living. Think of fishermen who have lost their boats. Think of farmers who lose their harvest, they lose their crops. Think of the tourism industry that will be affected. And that is just maybe just as serious as the other things. But what exactly is a natural disaster? And what makes it deadly? Let's have a look. First of all, it is a natural disaster. So it's caused by a natural phenomenon, a hurricane, a tornado. So that's the natural part. Of course, you can say, hey, this natural part is not 100% natural because it's probably affected by climate change. And that may be true because climate change is increasing, and at the same time, the number of natural disasters is increasing as well. So there might be a relationship between the two. Um, then it's called a natural disaster. Now let's have a look at that disaster part. What makes a disaster a disaster? Well, think of a very strong tornado. Think about a very strong tornado in the middle of the ocean, without any ships around. Would you call that a disaster? I don't think so, because it doesn't affect people. So it matters where people live. It matters where the natural disaster takes place. It also matters in what kind of conditions people live. Um, so I would describe a natural disaster as a natural phenomenon that interacts with a local context. And the vulnerability of people determines the impact of the disaster. Well, let's have a look. The point is that if a hurricane hits Haiti, probably there will be very bad consequences for the people there, because people live in simple houses. People live in poverty, and if the same hurricane would hit Washington D.C., the impact will be not as bad because the houses are stronger, maybe people are more prepared. So it matters where you live. Also, if you look on this world map, what, where do these natural disasters take place? Mostly around the equator, and that's also where most developing countries are, most poor countries are, and those so and poor people are more vulnerable to that because they live um, in s- in wooden houses and houses that are more simple. Now have a look at the world at night. Now what do you see? What's the difference? Is there anything you notice related to poverty or inequality? Think about that for a minute. As you see, the areas that are well lit are the most prosperous areas of this world. And also, that's where people probably have more money to be prepared for natural disasters and they live in better houses. Um, so the impact, so living conditions do matter. And of course, that living conditions, that's a human element to the natural disaster. Um, so let's go to an example. There was an earthquake in Turkey. The situation was like this. Um, because of economic prosperity, many people moved from the rural side of the country towards the cities in a short time. Flats were built, but although there are rules and regulations, these were not adhered to. When a strong earthquake hit Turkey, some of these flats collapsed. Of course, this leads to many casualties. And one can ask, how natural was this disaster? Was this a natural disaster or was this a man-made disaster? So it matters because it's no surprise that there are earthquakes in Turkey. And houses can be built, flats can be built in a way so they're more earthquake resistant. But that didn't happen. Um, so it matters how vulnerable people are at the place of a natural disaster. The local context matters. So my question is, how can you reduce vulnerability of people? How can you increase resilience of people? Well, on an individual level, you can buy supplies. You can have a radio that informs you, buy a flashlight, non-perishable food. Of course, if you have the money for that. Because some people will even go so far that they build their own bunkers under their house. Well, that's an extreme example, and also not many people are willing to do that or have the money to do that. and some people will call these people crazy. Well, if you look at the national level, um, there is a need to have plans in place. And of course, I'm not talking only about that the national government should deal with a natural disaster. There are many other organizations that found ways to deal with the natural disasters. It can be local organizations, it can be church organizations, NGOs, either nationally or internationally. Um, and and the first thing that's needed is early warning systems. You need to know when it happens. People need to be informed. Of course, some uh, natural disasters are you can easily predict. There's a lot of noise here. And some other disasters are hard to predict. For instance, volcanic eruption is difficult to predict. But then, when it happens, make sure people are informed as quickly as possible. So warn them as soon as possible. Um, by the way, I forgot to tell something. The old way of dealing with natural disasters was let the international NGOs enter the country and let them do their thing. Nowadays, efforts are more focused on national governments and on local organizations. The benefit is that they know the area, they know the people, they know their livelihoods, the way they make money, the way they are. And also, they are able to react faster. They're able to be at the places they need to be quicker. And but let's go back. How can communities become more resilient? Well, first of all, it's important to have early warning systems in place. I already told you about that. Second of all, local response mechanisms. People need to know what to do in case of a natural disaster. One example how to deal with this was after a hurricane in Bangladesh. There's a system in place that there are people who have received radios and bicycles. They listen to their wind-up radio, a radio without batteries, every day. They monitor that, and when they hear a hurricane is coming, they go with their bicycles to the communities nearby and they inform people that a hurricane is coming. People already know what to do, they know where to go. There's always either a church, a school building near that, a building that is strong, that can resist the disaster. Um, wait. For instance, for a flood, they know that they need to go to a higher area. Um, of course, there are still casualties happening, but much less than before. So these local response mechanisms really make a difference. Also in the USA, for instance, people are informed to block their windows, to make sure that they have their garden furniture inside of their houses when a hurricane comes. But let's have a look at the different stages of a natural disaster. So before we already talked about this, early warning systems, local response mechanisms, so people know what to do, they know buy supplies is possible. During during the disaster, um, well, it's very loud here. People are very loud here. Okay, during the magnitude becomes clear. It becomes clear what kind of disaster how strong it will be. Of course, the place matters, the length, And the time matters. It matters, does it happen during the evening or during the day? I mean, related to the damage and the casualties. So, what happens afterwards? Afterwards, you have the first phase. That's the first needs and survival, and then reconstruction. So, let's focus what needs to be done after after a natural disaster. So there was a huge hurricane, maybe tsunami, earthquake. The first thing that is needed is to rescue people and to help people. Maybe there is no electricity, maybe there's no water. People may have lost their houses. There's maybe no food available. People may be injured. So people need to be rescued out of damaged buildings, for instance. Um, People tend to think that it's the NGOs who do that, but in practice, it are the family, neighbors who are helping neighbors. It's family helping family to trying to find survivors in damaged houses. Um, at, of course, this first phase is focused on survival and the first needs. Um, it should be that this is only short term, that quickly people will know how to survive and the first needs are fulfilled. But sometimes this phase is not temporarily, but it will be for years and years and years. For instance, in Ethiopia, uh, farmers still receive food aid every year to survive between two harvests. Um, all right. And by the way, not everyone will receive help after a natural disaster. Some people may live in areas that are very hard to reach, areas that are very remote, and some people belong to groups within society that are excluded. So here's where politics comes in as well. Um, and by the way, it's also possible that this natural disaster happens in an area where there is a conflict, maybe even a war. And these conflicts interact with natural disasters in a complex ways. In Indonesia, for instance, in Aceh, after the tsunami, actually by these efforts after the tsunami, people worked together and different parties that were in conflict came together to make sure that people were helped and there was reconstruction. So disasters um, can decrease conflict, but I'm sure that the opposite is also possible. If some people are helped and some people are not helped, this can increase the conflict. Okay, and another case is the case in Somalia uh, and Kenya. There was a drought in that whole area. It was the same drought. I mean, it wasn't much different in Kenya than in Somalia, but in Kenya, I think I should say, this didn't lead to many casualties. In Somalia, however, thousands of people died. Why did this happen? It was the same drought. Why did more people die in Somalia? This was because the area was controlled by Al Shabaab, a militant extremist group who didn't let any food aid enter the country. Again, this is an example that shows that the disaster is not only natural, but there's really a human factor as well. The disaster is also man-made, and local context matters in that case. Local. All right. The second stage after natural disaster is reconstruction. Houses, infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. Where the first stage after a disaster is based on survival, this stage is focused on a continuation of normal life. People need to continue their lives, earn a living again. Um, and of course, a natural disaster may destroy ways of making a living. Um, with, with reconstruction, there's always a risk of corruption. This shouldn't be a surprise, as in the same countries, every infrastructure project is affected by this. But all right, now I've discussed the different stages of a natural disaster. Here you can see them again: the stage before, during, and after. Now my question to you is, what research questions can you think of related to natural disasters? What critical questions do you have about how organizations and governments deal with disasters? Think about this for a minute. So look at the table and think again, what kind of research questions can you ask to deal with natural disasters? Okay, well, first question you can ask is, how do local response mechanisms work? How effective are they? Well, you can talk with the government about that, but sorry, um, but that doesn't really. But you should talk to local people about that, because the government NGOs will say, "Oh, it worked fine," but local local people may tell a different story. The other thing is, how vulnerable are people? And if you want to do in-depth research, you have to look at the different capitals. Um, the human skills, human capital, the skills, knowledge people have. Natural capital, land, water, environment, the access to natural resources. Financial capitals, savings, credits, and income. Physical capital, that's infrastructure and transport and physical things people have. And social capital, that's the relations people have, the networks. Are people able to help each other or not, willing to help each other? And of course, these capitals affect vulnerability and also how resilient they are to natural disasters. Okay, the other questions you can ask yourself is, was the response of organizations or the government effective? I already talked about this. It's also important to talk to different groups within societies, because different people may have different views about this. And you can research if certain groups were excluded from receiving help, and how successful was the reconstruction phase. And of course there can be exclusion there as well, and corruption. Okay, so and of course some disasters are 100% man-made. I'm talking about natural disasters, but some man-made disasters can be just as bad. Can you think of examples? I'm thinking about if you're a farmer and the market price goes way down, you have a big problem. That's just as bad as a hurricane, maybe. Pollution, conflicts, war, that's, well, the most extreme example of a man-made disaster. So, to summarize, what's my summary of this presentation? The impact of a natural disaster does not only depend on the magnitude of the natural phenomenon, but also on human factors. It depends on the vulnerability of the people, living conditions, and poverty, exclusion. But the impact also depends on the resilience of people. Are there early warning systems? Are there local response mechanisms? So actually it also matters how people deal with natural disasters. People are not just victims of natural disasters, they're also ways people found to cope with these natural disasters, even in poor countries. And that's the good news, that on one hand, the number of disasters is increasing over the world, but the ways people cope with natural disasters is improving. So the number of casualties per disaster is decreasing. So that's the kind of the good and the bad news. And of course, there are different actors involved. Not just the government, not just NGOs, many more organizations, and also relatives, neighbors, and stuff. Well, thank you for watching this video. Um, I want to give a special thanks to Thea Hilhorst. She's a specialist in natural disasters. Her videos really inspired me. Not sure what she thinks about this video, but I hope I will hear soon. I hope I have been able to give you a realistic picture about the reality of natural disasters. And thank you for watching. If you like this video, you don't need to press the like button or to subscribe. Comments are welcome. And thanks for watching this video again.